This is VikesNow with Dustin Baker, the Friday, April 15th edition. I'm here with Nick Olson. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing marvelous. I'm hoping you'll break down some Vikings topics for us and maybe some predictions. First of all, here's what I want to know about you in case there's anybody that's watching that doesn't know too much about you. I want to know how and when you discovered this purple team and how did you kind of rise to prominence within the Vikings community?
Good questions. I grew up in Minnesota and now live outside New York. But yeah, I grew up. It was the '98 season. Randy Moss. It was probably that Week 4 game against the Packers when I got to strut into school and rub it in all my Packers friends' faces that week. So that '98 season with Moss and everybody, that was when I got hooked as a kid. And as for when I grew in prominence, I guess I've been kind of blogging about the Vikings for few years, for a while on like Reddit, other social media. Probably migrated most of my takes to Twitter a few years ago, and since then, as luck would have it, people enjoy my memes and my analysis, I guess. So yeah, it's just kind of grown from there. So
and if I'm not mistaken, my fallen friend Joe Johnson, you crossed paths with him a couple times, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Joe is one of the first people to give me a shot. Not just like blogging or and social media posting, but actually up at Vikings territory. Had some great years there, and still write for Vikings territory occasionally, and now writing for zone coverage too. That's kind of Vikings territory spilled into zone coverage as well, which is spilled over into collaborations with lots of folks in the blogosphere as well. So yeah, thank you for reminding me that I'm not just a Twitter taker haver. I also write actual articles and stuff too.
Yeah, there's some credibility there. I actually
Believe
joined
it or not.
I joined. Well, he's got a suit on, so you got to be semi.
Yeah. That's projecting. That's me. Like, yeah, I'm not just a Twitter talking head. So.
I joined the gang kind of around that same time. So from 1994, 1997, I lived in Houston, Texas. And we found out in 1996 that my stepdad had got a job of Minneapolis. But back then, at that time in Southern United States, the housing market was the inverse of what it was right now. It took forever to sell your house. So the Oilers sucked then. And I went to a lot of Oilers games. But incidentally, Warren Moon was playing for the Vikings, and I was moving to Minneapolis, and all my friends liked Warren Moon, and they had started to convert to Vikings fans because the Oilers were so shitty. So we finally got to Minneapolis, excuse me, 97. They had a sweet-ass playoff win that year, like a crazy wild sequence at the end of the game. And then, of course, I was right there with you, 98. It was solidified for me. Like, all right, whatever this team just put into my stomach, the way that I just felt watching him catch those touchdowns, that can't be replicated. So for better or the worse, I think we joined the party about the same time.
Oh yeah, that was fun years. Moss, Carter, Jake Reed.
Oh yeah. That's kind of the debate. We'll get into the draft here in a few minutes, but it's like the number one with a bullet thing in support of taking a wide receiver possibly this year. If one of those guys that Kwesi loves is there, is we have no better example than 1998 because we were set. Totally set with Carter and Reed, and boom, everything changed when they got Moss. All right, so I want to talk about the offensive trenches. I've asked a couple of other guests about this. I think that you'll agree the pass protecting, especially at right guard, since Joe Berger left, the right guard spot's been nasty, and consequently the line's pass protecting acumen has stunk. Why do you think it's been so hard for the previous regime to either identify that or fix it? And do you think that this current brand of leadership is taking reasonable steps to finally fix it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, they certainly tried. The Rick Spielman era tried to fix the offensive line. They just couldn't, they tried everything and it couldn't work. They invested so much draft cap. Mm-hmm. The only team that's invested more is the Colts. If you look at the offensive line right now, Garrett Bradbury, first rounder, Brian O'Neill, second rounder, Christian Darrisaw, first rounder, Pat Elflein was a third rounder, Wyatt Davis was a third rounder. So they're investing a lot of Ezra Cleveland, second rounders. They've invested a lot of draft capital in there. And on top of that, they spent a lot of money. Riley Reef was a pretty expensive free agent. Alex Boone was a pretty expensive free agent. They brought in some second and other third tier guys. But for whatever reason, the Colts invest all this draft capital and boom, they have, the greatest line in the NFL. Vikings invest all this draft capital and, half of these guys don't even get, extensions or their fifth year options exercised or whatever. So yeah, it's just a string of bad luck. I don't know. I don't know if it's the college scouting or the coaching, or probably doesn't help that they hire a new offensive line coach every single year. And Tony Sperano's unfortunate passing, obviously plays into that as well. So it's hard to be consistent. And they've also dealt with some. There have been years where the injuries just kept mounting up. 2018 in particular stands out to me as a year where the injuries kept mounting up. It's interesting talking about like how important are the trenches in terms of securing a Super Bowl. I mean, obviously a lot of Super Bowl winning teams have great offensive lines, but a lot of Super Bowl winning teams have good rosters generally. I think if you look at the Rams last year, they've actually kind of assembled a ragtag group and managed to, that was not the area where they invested. I mean, their entire interior offensive line was, they traded for a guy, I think from Buffalo, or was it from Cleveland? Austin Corbett was like, they traded a 6th rounder for Corbett. They drafted Brian Allen or whatever in the 5th or 6th rounds. The other guy was a day 3 draft pick as well. So, obviously Andrew Whitworth, an all pro, but they signed him for cheap, and just were able to unlock some longevity there. So they're if we look at I don't love the heuristic of look at, what the last Super Bowl winner did and copycat that plan, but you look at what the Rams did, you don't necessarily have to have an all world offensive line. It certainly helps. And when you've got what the Vikings had in 2019, where they just got demolished by the 49ers, or you look at what the Vikings had in 2017, when they just got demolished by the Eagles, it's also easy to look at what the Vikings offensive line is right now and think this team isn't going to go anywhere, especially when you have a traditional pocket passer at quarterback like Kirk Cousins, as compared to, pick your Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson, somebody with a lot more athleticism, creativity back in the pocket. So I think the current regime understands that Cousins is a pocket passer. Kevin O'Connell himself was, a pocket passer himself. So I think he understands, like, they talk a lot about, we need to put Cousins in a situation where he can really thrive and give him what he needs to thrive. And part of that is, not having turnstiles at center and right guard and everywhere else along the offensive line. I think it helps that they've got bookends at tackle. That's the hardest thing to pin down. O'Neal, obviously coming off a Pro Bowl season, a really, really good player. Christian Darrisaw, I think he was a rookie and he had a lot of mistakes, but I think you also saw a lot of potential there. And Ezra Cleveland, is a solid left guard who, his athleticism is really special. So those are 3 solid pieces. Bradbury, it feels like they might be able to unlock a little bit more about him. Obviously, he struggles a lot to anchor as pass protector, and there are technique ways to try and tweak that. But the center is they're not going to be as responsible for as much pass protection just because they're not one-on-one as often. It's the right guard spot where they really need to fix it, and they're they drafted Wyatt Davis, but we'll see if he manages to contribute this season. Sounded like things didn't work out for him last year. I like the kind of the approach they took. I would have liked to see them maybe, spend a little bit more to get somebody who's like a solid day one, write him in pen at right guard. Like, I liked Eric Flowers when Washington, Washington's more of a power team, so they don't need more of a zone scheme guard like Eric Flowers was. So that was somebody I thought might fit, but instead they went the route with the other Davis and Reed. And, it's kind of the Brandon Bean approach, and Buffalo's had a lot of success, kind of actually like the Rams did have, just like bringing in a bunch of guys and throwing them at them and having an actual competition of guys who played like starters, and that's kind of like Reed last year. Like, they got him for a cheap contract, but he stepped in pretty well for the Colts as a backup and played like a starting caliber guy. So you bring in these guys who aren't like vet minimum guys, but, they are rotational guys or backup guys, and they have potential in there. And you see maybe one of these guys can fit, because that's, Josh Klein is another guy who's like, he wasn't an expensive guy, but he was somebody who, did an adequate job on the Titans and on the Patriots, and he came over to the Vikings and he did an adequate job there. And adequate is a huge upgrade over Dakota Dozier, and to say nothing of like Drew Samia. So those are, I think those are reasonable steps. You would have liked to see them spend a little bit more, but also, they're so cap strapped, they had to rework every single contract, every single expensive contract on the roster. So given the limited amount of resources they have, I think they're taking reasonable steps. I don't think it's going to be, magically an amazing offensive line. But we saw, it's interesting thinking about what Kwesi did in Cleveland when they brought in Bill Callahan, who's a legendary offensive line coach. In Kwesi's tenure, they really turned that offensive line around. So hopefully, we can see a similar turnaround, but unfortunately, we don't have a Bill Callahan, and we don't have the resources to sort of, go out there and spend first rounders and sign premium free agents and stuff. So we'll see. But hopefully Kwesi can work a little bit of magic and have better luck where Spielman didn't.
What I told viewers to the show is that so they got four dudes, the Davises, Chris Reed, Oli Udo, and for it not to be average, salvageable, decent, or good, four dudes are going to have to suck, and a coaching staff can't figure any of them out. So it's in years past with Zimmer and Spielman, it seems like at this spot in particular, right guard, you'd have two dudes, and now it's the usual suspects plus Reed and Jesse Davis. So that gives me a little hope that it can't be this Twilight Zone, like multiple executives can't figure it out. So that's what gives me hope. Let's talk a little bit about Kellen Mond. On this show, I've talked to Ben Lieber, and then on my other show, Brian McKinney, I've talked to Paul Charchian. They said the exact same thing about Kellen Mond, and it wasn't flattering. They're saying, if you thought Cousins was a robot, wait until you see Mond. And then a couple other guests are ho-hum on him. So this draft class, the one we're in right now, is kind of underwhelming. So it kind of makes me think like, well, maybe Mond is our rookie this year, and if a coaching staff can get a hold of him, blah, blah, blah. What is your pulse on Mond? Does he excite you as a life after Kirk option or not so much?
Yeah, I'd probably say not so much. I don't want to write the guy off or anything. After 1 year, the thing about Mond is, he showed incremental progress every year of his career in college. And I think he showed progress even in his last year. I mean, obviously, the very brief game action he got against the Packers, he was in there for like 3 snaps and almost threw a pick six. So didn't go so great, but even in like the preseason, you watch his college tape and you see some tools there, but also you see a very stiff player with a lot of mechanics that needed to be reworked. And I think even in the preseason, his footwork already looked a lot more crisp. He was able to get through his reads maybe a little bit faster. So robotic is probably a fair way to characterize him. I would also just say like he's kind of stiff in his movement. Stiff. He's got like when he drops back in the pocket, it's just kind of like his feet are just like there's some tightness to him. So I think he's got potential. He's kind of like in the Colin Kaepernick mold where he's got a good arm and he's got good legs, but he's not going to necessarily put them together and be I guess it's just a way of saying he's got a long way of going. But quarterbacks improve every year they're in the NFL. I mean, Kirk Cousins, it's funny. People think of Kirk Cousins as like a finished product, but he's improved so much. If you go back and watch his Washington tape, he's just improved so much since his time in Washington. Or even if you just go look back at his 2018 Vikings tape, he's improved a lot since 2018, both in terms of how he deals with pressure, how he senses it, his ability to get through his reads a little bit more quickly. So he's gotten better as a quarterback as well. I certainly think Kellen Mond, just as a sophomore, I wouldn't write him off just yet. But yeah, that said, Mike Zimmer faced some criticism for when he said, like, I don't need to see any more of Kellen Mond. I see enough of him in practice every day. But that's probably true. Like, Zimmer probably sees Kellen Mond, like literally Zimmer saw Kellen Mond every day at practice. And doesn't seem like the things are that encouraging. The fact that they decided to bring back Sean Mannion probably suggests that Kevin O'Connell also saw the Kellen Mond practice tape and thought, maybe it's worth bringing in some additional, competition here. I think Mannion also got some guaranteed money there as well. So it's not just a camp body, I think. So there's potential. I wouldn't pencil in Mond right now as the backup right away. So I'm not saying it was a worthless pick. He's going nowhere. He'll never amount to anything, but I do think he's got more than enough work cut out for him. And, luckily he's made progress every year of his career. So if he just keeps that trajectory up, eventually he'll get a solid backup potential to maybe even be a starter somewhere, a low end starter down the road. But that's a high end that it would take a lot of luck, I think, to get there. So yeah, I'm not too, he's an interesting guy with interesting tools, but at this point, he's got a ways to go before he gets there.
Okay. I'm going to ask you in about 5 minutes about that Cousins improving every year, because there's some folks that seem to think that, they joke like, whoa, somebody else is just going to magically unlock Kirk in his mid-30s. So we're going to talk about that. Don't let me forget in a minute. But I'll be remiss if I didn't chat about the draft, because that's 2 weeks from right now. In fact, we should know the pick if they don't trade in the first round by this time, 2 weeks from now. So tell us your forecast. I want a name or two at the 12th pick. Or if you don't want to be nailed down to that, do you predict a trade back, a trade up? What do we got?
I think if Derek Stingley is on the board, I expect them to take him. And I think that's not really a secret. He's the name most commonly mocked to the Vikings. The Vikings, even after bringing back Patrick Peterson, signing Chandon Sullivan, bringing in Nate Hairston, some of these other guys, there's still, you look at the roster for 2023, and the only starting cornerback on the roster is Cam Dantzler. And Cam Dantzler himself, like I love the guy, but at 170 pounds, the guy's nickname is the Needle. It's probably not going to be able to withstand 17 games his whole career. I think he's just going to get banged up. So they need desperately to invest in the cornerback position, especially considering with Donatell's scheme, that's a scheme where they like to have very good cornerbacks, and you ask a lot of those cornerbacks. I mean, last year the Broncos with Donatell ran second most cover one in the NFL, and they did that because they used their first round pick on Patrick Surtain. So I think, and Kwesi's coming from, they spent their first round pick, I think it was last year, on Greg Newsome. So and the year before that, their second round pick on Grant Delpit. So Kwesi is aligned on investing in the secondary. The defense we're running, the next year, the Fangio Donatell scheme is aligned on investing in the secondary. So I think if Stingley's on the board, he's probably the one who makes the most sense. It also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our defensive backs coach, Durante Jones, he was our defensive backs coach also in 2020, but in between those 2 years, he was LSU's defensive backs coach and defensive coordinator with Derek Stingley. So if Durante Jones signs off on Derek Stingley and says this guy can be who he was as a freshman at LSU, we can re-unlock that magic. Then yeah, I think Stingley has the potential to be the best player in this entire draft class. His upside is that high. He's a little bit boomer bust with the injuries, inconsistent play, ball production, just tanked to nothing the last couple of years. And, even as a rookie, he had some rough games. In 2019 and 2020, he really struggled against Devonta Smith and the Bama games. So he's not a infallible prospect, but you look at his movement skills, you look at his ball protection, some of the interceptions he had, some of the highlights he has, some of the best tape you'll ever see from a cornerback prospect. So that's who I think would make the most sense. If Stingley is off the board, I do expect them, though, to trade back. Okay. And this is something that Andrew Barry did the last couple of years with Kwesi as his right-hand man in Cleveland. Last two drafts, they traded back, I think, 3 times or something. So it was usually in the later rounds, but I think you're already seeing some names up there. The Saints are looking to move up for a quarterback. The Steelers are looking to move up for a quarterback. I've seen some rumblings about the Chiefs wanting to move up for Jameson Williams because that's their Tyreek Hill replacement. Something Chiefs have, we've got a lot of these teams with multiple first-round picks at the end of the round. I think the Vikings are going to be one of the number one teams looking to move down because they've got a lot of needs in the long term beyond just cornerback. And I think there are some good cornerbacks who are going to be available later in the draft, like Andrew Booth, like Trent McDuffie, like Kaiir Elam. So later in the first round. So I can definitely see them moving back and saying, if Stingley isn't there, maybe, we're happy moving down to the 20s and taking, who's left compared to, out of Booth or McDuffie or someone. In the same way that last year, when the Chargers took that left tackle, I'm blanking on his name, but once he was off the board, they were like, okay, well, we'll move down, we'll scoop up Christian Darrisaw, we'll get 2 third-rounders on top of it and get the guy we wanted anyway. So I could see that also happening if Stingley's off the board by 12. But if he is there, I expect them to sprint to the podium and take Stingley because I think they probably have a very high opinion of Stingley and see him as, in the same way that Patrick Peterson was this just incredible LSU prospect with all the intangibles and all the movement skills and all the bodies, all the like just the perfect built in a lab cornerback. I think Stingley has those similar types of movement skills, fluidity, and the potential to be an all-pro type cornerback. So I think it'd be hard to turn that down if he's there at 12.
Okay, let's go on to this next topic. This is the ceiling topic about Cousins. So Matthew Stafford went from the Lions, who we know intimately, to the Rams. In 1 year, it gelled with this Hollywood roster, and they won a Super Bowl. And if you look at statistics for the last decade or amongst their careers at similar times, Cousins and Stafford are always bedfellows in terms of statistics. However, Stafford is loved and Cousins is, controversial, a lightning rod, a joke topic at times. So I think what the Vikings are trying to do, especially hiring Kevin O'Connell, is channel some of that. Like, let's do offensive minded. Let's unlock Kirk like the Rams unlocked Stafford. I think that's the mentality. Do you think that there is such a thing as Kevin O'Connell unlocking Kirk at the age, it'll be 34? Or do you think that we have seen Cousins' ceiling by now?
I think there's no, and I think there's 2 main reasons why. One, I think, like I said before, Kirk Cousins isn't the same quarterback he was 3 years ago or 6 years ago. he's gotten better as a quarterback as the years have gone on. He's gotten more accurate. He's one of the most accurate passers in the NFL. That wasn't true when he was, just in his first couple starting seasons when he was taking over for RG3 after RG3 got hurt. He's gotten a lot quicker at reading the entire field. He's better reading disguises pre-snap and post-snap. He's more decisive with the football. He's a little bit more aggressive. He's able to create when things break down. He's not like amazing at it, but you see him scramble for yards. If people give him green space, he'll take the free yards upfield. That wasn't always the case with Kirk Cousins. I mean, he had some designed runs early in Washington when they kept kind of like some of the RG3 zone read stuff. Like if you go back and Cousins had like 15 rushing touchdowns in his 3 seasons in Washington or something like that. And a lot of that's because they kept a lot of the same RG3 play calls. But those were designed runs. It wasn't Cousins like scrambling for green space. Now you see him do that a little bit more. You see him sense blindside pressure a little bit. I think it's one thing that one play that really stands out is towards the end of the Panthers game last year, Brian Burns just like demolished Christian Darrisaw, got to Cousins like within 2 seconds, just like blink of an eye, just ghost technique, got right to Cousins. And instead of normally, I think the Kirk Cousins of the past, that would have been a strip sack to like lose the game. Instead, what you saw is Kirk Cousins held on to the football, sensed the pressure coming, held on to the football, and then saw the green grass upfield because Burns had rushed around the pocket. And so he just sprinted upfield and picked up a first down there. So one example out of many, but like, that's just one example. Cousins is a better quarterback this year than he was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that's part of it. And that's true, by the way, if you look at his statistics, you look at his Pro Football Focus grade, it's basically gone up and up and up and up every single year. The other part of that though is like people say like, oh yeah, well Cousins puts up all these stats, these amazing stats, but it never translates to wins. He's a 500 quarterback over his career, and even in his career as a Viking, he's a 500 quarterback. So for all his fancy stats, why doesn't he win? And I think that's even that's a fair criticism. Good quarterbacks tend to win. Kirk Cousins doesn't win. So why is that? Is he just the least lucky quarterback in the world? Is there something else going on there? Is it because he's too expensive and you can't fill the talent around him? That's a really interesting conversation to have. But the one thing I will say, though, is you look at how much better Kirk Cousins has gotten. His best season from an offensive efficiency perspective was 2016, back when he was not a very good quarterback, but when Sean McVay was the one calling the shots in that offense under Jake Gruden in 2016. So when he had those like the Kyle Shanahan and the Sean McVays back there in Washington, he put up some pretty impressive stats. I think he had the 5th best offensive efficiency by EPA per play back in 2016 with Sean McVay as his offensive coordinator. That was back when he wasn't a very good quarterback. He was probably like the 20th best quarterback in the NFL at that time, because really he wasn't even really thought of as a starter or it took him a while for him to be earned the starter job because of RG3's health issues. So, and Cousins was a green quarterback who still had a lot of development to do. He's a much better quarterback now than he was back then. And so if they were able to unlock, the 5th best offense in the NFL with a bad Kirk Cousins back in 2016, how much better can you get in 2022 if you have a Sean McVay type offense? If Kevin O'Connell is able to be as good as Sean McVay, and obviously that's a huge if, because just because the guy was his right-hand man doesn't mean he's any bit as good as the other guy. We've seen that logic fail a lot of times. But if he is, man, you're going to get a much better quarterback. And the one thing I'll say is like, we've seen Kirk Cousins work with different offensive coordinators, even in the Vikings. like John DeFilippo, Cousins had like one of the worst efficiencies in the NFL. That offense stunk. But Kevin Stefanski took him to a playoff spot, made him look like, hey, maybe Kirk Cousins is the answer. Get back to Clint Kubiak, and things are looking, like, why are there so many 3 and outs? Why can't we stay on the field? So the offensive coordinator and the play caller matters a lot. And I think just in the approach the Vikings have had to this offseason, I think you can really believe that you can really buy into the diagnosis that it was the system last year, because look at all the money that they spent on the defense. They brought back Patrick Peterson. They signed Zadarius Smith, kind of their biggest signing of the offseason. They signed a bunch of other cornerbacks. They signed Jordan Hicks. They signed Harrison Phillips. They kind of, other than these like bargain bin guards, they haven't really touched the offense. So they feel they have the talent to win on offense, and they think the scheme can unlock it. Last year, they were, I think, 16th in offensive EPA per play. That's, when you have Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook, everybody else, you're set at both of your tackle spots. That's pretty inexcusable. So do I believe that we have the second coming of Sean McVay? I don't know. I'll have to see how it all comes together. But do I believe that a better scheme could make, Kirk Cousins look a little bit more like what he was under Kevin Stefanski or what he was under Sean McVay compared to what we've seen the last year or so. Yeah, I can buy into that.
Okay. All right. The last question I have, I'm super curious about your answer. Do you consider the depth pre-draft for these Minnesota Vikings reasonably deep, right in the middle, or kind of paper thin?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because you kind of have to define what we mean by depth and not to be a lawyerly and pedantic on you. But, if we're talking about a lot of teams' backups are not starting caliber guys, because if they were, they would probably earn enough money to play somewhere else. But that said, there are teams that, whether it's the Buccaneers with all their wide receivers or the Packers, how they always seem to have, like last year, they had so many Elton Jenkins and David Bakhtiari missed so much time. They had guys step up and still put together a pretty good offensive line anyway. There are some places where I think the Vikings look pretty okay. I think I look at the trenches right now and I think losing Danielle Hunter, losing Zadarius Smith, losing some of these guys would hurt a lot. But like Armon Watts is a pretty good pass rusher, especially as a 3 technique penetrating defensive tackle. James Lynch was so improved last year. He's pretty stout as a run defender as well. It's a little undersized still, but those 2 guys are pretty good. I wouldn't call them starting caliber, but that's pretty good depth at the defensive tackle position. DJ Wanham, I didn't love him as your starting defensive end, but as a 3rd defensive end rotating in, he's a pretty good player, especially as like a rotational pass rusher. So the depth there isn't that bad. And I mentioned the trenches, not just because of the defensive line, but I also think like if Oli Udoh is your swing tackle, he's not like a starting caliber guard, but he's not, there are a lot of worse backups as the Vikings fans have seen than Oli Udoh in the game. So not just him, but there's a bunch of other guys on the offensive line, like the reason they bring in these Jesse Davises and stuff and is that, the one who doesn't win the job can probably come in and compete as well. So the offensive line depth, I think, isn't that bad. And I'll say like the wide receiver depth could be, there are teams with worse wide receiver rooms than KJ Osborne as their 3rd wide receiver and Amir Smith-Marset as their 4th wide receiver. And both of those guys, I think, KJ Osborne had like 650 yards, 7 touchdowns last year. That's pretty good for your 3rd wide receiver. In fact, that's the best. That's the best for a Vikings. For the record, that's the best, wide receiver 3 in Vikings history. So at least statistically, obviously, Jake Reed was a pretty darn good wide receiver 3 for the Vikings. But Jake Reed, once Moss and Carter came in, he was not putting up 7 touchdowns, 650 yards. So KJ Osborne did. Part of that was the Thielen injuries, but he's a talented player. And then Amir Smith-Marset, we saw him break out late in the year. He had that 100-yard game. So the depth at wide receiver is not terrible. All that said, like if Kirk Cousins goes down, this team is screwed. If Patrick Peterson goes down, Chris Boyd is not a starting caliber cornerback. The entire back 7, if Harrison Smith goes down, I don't even know who the backup is. Like Cam Bynum's the 2nd guy. I couldn't tell you.
Miles Dorn.
I get paid to cover the Vikings. I don't know if it's Miles Dorn or Josh Metellus or who it is. They're in a little bit of trouble. One of those guys go down. Same thing is true. I think, if you lose Eric Kendricks or one of those guys, I don't know who is it. Troy Dye, the next guy up. Troy Dye can't defend the run, so I don't know what you do there. The depth is, especially at some of these positions, they're going to be, if they succumb to injuries, they're going to be tested. Some of the other ones like Madison, not the worst backup running back in the world. And Ken Nwangwu like really broke out last year, especially as a special teamer, but he had some good runs as well. So there are positions where it's like not the end of the world. If, Dalvin Cook gets banged up, if Harrison Phillips gets banged up, if Zadarius Smith misses a few games, I think they're equipped to handle it. But there are a lot of other positions where like, man, I'm like, it's a good thing that the draft is like, less than 2 weeks away because, man, they could use some fresh new talent to replenish some of these guys. So, I would say overall it's pretty poor. So.
Okay. All right. That's fair. That's what I think too. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't being too critical. All right. So at Nick Olson NFL, that's your Twitter, at Nick Olson NFL. You write for zone coverage every now and then from Vikings territory. Any closing arguments, any final thoughts for the VikesNow show tonight?
No, I'm just really excited for the draft. I think, it's interesting looking at what the Browns have done the last couple of years because that kind of, I think, gives a little bit of a blueprint. I think 2 things that stand out to me when I was looking back at what the Browns did the last 2 years, not just, I mentioned they invested in the secondary. I think you're going to see that here. They traded down a lot. I think you're probably going to see that too. I think this is a team that believes this, and they especially traded not just down, but they traded for future picks as well. I think they did that twice where they picked for like the next year's 4th or next year's 3rd. And they were able to sort of replenish their treasure trove of draft picks over the years. So I think neither of those moves would surprise me. But one thing, it's not the analytic smart thing to do, but one thing they did last year that really paid off for them is they traded up in the second round for that linebacker, JOK. So I could see them, it wouldn't surprise me if if it was the full Rick Spielman experience all over again, where they're trading down, they're trading up, they're wheeling and dealing. The other thing I'll say is Andrew Berry especially valued youth in his draft picks. And as a result, the Browns have, and in fact, this was part of their pitch to land Deshaun Watson. They said, like Deshaun, we have one of the youngest rosters in the NFL because all these guys we've drafted are like 20 years old. So it would not shock me if, Spielman didn't care about age. And he even said that at like his combine pressers or his post-draft pressers, like, yeah, it's we don't really care if somebody breaks out late, that's fine. Like all we care about is like, what can they contribute to the team when we get there and how can we mold them to make them a better player? Kwesi definitely cares, I think, about age. And I don't think it's much of a surprise that some of these names you've seen connect to the Vikings, like Derek Stingley, one of the youngest, I think like the 10th youngest player in the draft. Some of these other guys you've seen connected, like some of the youngest players. So if you're trying to read the tea leaves on where the Vikings will go on draft day, I think age is one number to pay a little bit more attention to than you would have in the past. So that's kind of my little bit of a reading tea leaves as far as what we're going to see in 2 weeks. But either way, I love the draft. It's one of the most fun times of the year because like, one, you're seeing all these kids' dreams come true, their lifelong dream they've worked towards. So that's always really fun to like share in that. So much of sports is like zero sum, but the draft is like every team wins. So that's kind of fun to see. And it's also just like, I don't know, hope springs eternal. And every fan base is like, we solved all our problems. We addressed all our needs. We're Super Bowl or bust this year. So it's fun to see not just the players, dreams come true, but also like see every fan base get really excited about the direction of their team. So hopefully the Vikings have another really fun draft. So I'm looking forward to it.
My final story for tonight is talking about JOK for the Browns. So last April, my wife and I drove to Cleveland because the NFL draft is free to go to. I don't know. A lot of people don't know that, but it's free. You just have to drive there, pay for your hotel. And that was kind of our first trip in the COVID world. And we got out on the open road. We're like, this is kind of weird. So anyhow, we got there and then it was kind of shitty out, rainy and cold. So the Vikings anticlimactically traded back. So we skipped out at about probably, I think it was right after Darisaw was picked, got back to the vehicle. And their version of K-Fan is arguing, debating at their pick, whatever they had. They were saying, do we want Newsom or do we want JOK? And that was in the first round. So they were bitching back and forth to each other, like, no, I want JOK because he's blah, 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 sure thing. And the other guy was like, I want Newsom. And then, 24 hours later, they had both because, they managed the board well. And like you said, they traded back in to get JOK. So, yeah, I would expect some of that too, adding defensive depth in the vein of Andrew Berry. All right, Nick, I hope you'll come back this summer and talk to us maybe as kind of that training camp vibe starts to heat up. But we appreciate you joining.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure. Always fun to come on. So I would love to do something post-draft or camp or as we get into the preseason. It's always fun talking Vikings.
All right. Skol, baby.